Hello, and welcome to Recipes with Ben. In today's video, I'm making pretzel buns from scratch for the very first time, so stick around in the end to see how they turn out. Like most yeasted doughs, I'm going to start by adding 1 teaspoon of baker's yeast to a mixing bowl. After adding the yeast, it's time for some liquid, and while you can use water if that's what you want, I'm going to add a German-inspired twist by using this Vienna lager that I had in my house. After pouring in the beer, I used a whisk to assist in degassing the beer to kind of remove some of the carbon dioxide. To help give the yeast something to munch on, I'm going to add in a tablespoon of sugar, followed by some fat. And in this recipe, I'm going to add 1 tablespoon of melted butter. But I need it to be cold enough so that it won't kill the yeast when I first add it. So I microwaved it for about 30 seconds and let it cool down on the countertop before adding it into the yeast mixture. I then mixed it all together and let it activate for about 10 to 15 minutes at room temperature. What I saw after that time was a little bubble starting to form on the top layer. So next it's time for the flour. So I'm going to use 475 grams of flour, but do this in 2 portions. So after adding in about 250 grams, I transferred the bowl to a stand mixer that had a dough hook attached to it. I turned the speed on to medium and began adding in the rest of the flour and allowed that to knead for several minutes until the dough stopped clinging to the sides of the bowl. Once it reached this point, I took out a small piece to check for gluten development by using the window pane method, and then it was time for its first proof. I wanted to use the same bowl, so I took the dough out and re-oiled the inside of the bowl and placed the dough back inside after oiling it, spraying the oil around with my hand. I then formed a dough ball and placed it inside the bowl and covered it with a towel to let it proof for at least 2 hours, or if you're following along, until at least doubled in size. I tested the proofing by giving it a little poke and was ready for the next step. I then scooped the dough out of the bowl and placed it on a cutting board, where I punched out all of the air in the dough. As I knocked out the air, I was forming it into a rectangle shape so it could easily be divided into 8 separate pieces of dough. I'm going to use a pastry cutter to cut out those 8 pieces of dough, and if you want to make sure that each roll is the same size, I recommend using some kind of scale so you can weigh out and make sure each ball has the same amount of dough in it. For me, I'm just going to eyeball it so they will turn out a few different sizes in the end. With each piece of dough, I pinched it into itself to form a tight ball and rolled it out into a sphere after pinching it. I'm going to cover it with the same towel for a second proofing, which should only take about 15 minutes. And during that time, I began to prep the water. For that, I need 1 liter of water, and I placed that into a large pot. And then I began to heat that towards a boil. Once it reached a boil, I started adding in the baking soda to create a basic solution. It's important to note that you don't want to add all the baking soda at once, because as this is heated, the baking soda will release some gas, and doing it all at once could cause it to boil over and make a big mess. And then it was time to add the buns after the second proofing. One method to help the buns keep their shape is while you're proofing them, you could have put them on a piece of parchment paper. And once they're on that, you can drop it into the water, holding one corner and pulling it away as it enters into the water. And this will help it slip directly into the bath. Then it's time to cook for about 20 to 30 seconds on each side. And after that time, you want to flip it over and cook it for the same amount of time. So another 20 to 30 seconds. Cooking in the basic water bath helps create that chewy interior that is characteristic of pretzels. Then using something like a slotted spatula to remove it from the water and place it on the silicone baking mat before we cook it. I then repeated it with the rest of the buns, and before I place them in the oven, it was important that I score them across the top. So as they do heat and release steam, there's a place for it to escape so it doesn't burst out onto the sides. So I use a small paring knife, but a razor blade would also work to cause these scorings. And then it was time for me to bake them in a preheated oven that I had set to 425 degrees. I found that between 15 to 18 minutes and more on the 18-minute side was good enough to create a deep brown color. But if you want a little bit deeper, maybe a couple more minutes would help. You can see that I'm no expert baker, but overall, they look pretty good for my first attempt. The exterior has a deep brown color, and the bottoms are fully cooked. And when I cut it open, you can see there's no raw dough, and it has that chewy texture that's characteristic of a pretzel. I will say that one thing that this recipe should have after trying them is salt. And I think if you added at least 1 teaspoon of salt when I was adding the flour in the beginning. It would have helped to elevate the flavor even more. Also, right before you place the buns in the oven, you can sprinkle some coarse salt over the top just like you would a normal pretzel. So please let me know down in the comment section what tips you have for improving these pretzel buns, and maybe I'll try them again in a future video. With all that said, thank you so much for watching. If you found any of this helpful, smash that like button, and please consider subscribing so I don't miss the next one. I'll see you again soon.